everyone, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Hannah if you're new here. In today's video, I'm going to be recommending some adult science fiction and fantasy series that are complete. All the books are out and published and available to the world. Specifically, I'm going to be framing this list as books I was looking for when I was transitioning from reading exclusively young adult to trying out adult for the first time. So the first couple of books and series on this list are going to be books that I think would appeal to a young adult reader, and as we get further down the list, the fantasy elements are going to become more and more advanced in terms of the fantasy elements, the hard fantasy and science fiction that might be a little bit trickier or might not appeal as much to someone just starting out reading adult fantasy for the first time. Without further ado, I'm just going to start with the first series recommendation, and that is the Rook and Rose trilogy by author duo M.A. Carrick. The first book in the series is The Mask of Mirrors, and this series contains 3 books that are all out and published, and I have read all of them. And also, this series is numbered on the spines, which, as fantasy readers, we greatly appreciate. This series is about con woman Ren, who's trying to pretend to be someone else to ingratiate herself into this wealthy political family, and the family is very skeptical of her because what they don't want anyone to know is that they're going bankrupt. And so Ren is trying to pull off this big con, and of course secrets are exposed, lots of politics happens, and that's all I'll say about the plot summary. The reason I think this is a great introduction into adult fantasy is because while the stakes are high and there's a lot of plot happening and, even some violence to an extent, I would say the writing is incredibly accessible. The characters are very lovable and fun to read from. There are some familiar tropes in here that I think young adult readers would resonate with. And also, this is the antithesis of grimdark. I read an interview with Marie Brennan, one of the authors of this author duo, and she was talking about how she wanted to write a story that was the antithesis of grimdark, something that was lighthearted and fun, and you knew the characters were kind of gonna be okay in the end. And I don't think that takes away from the overall enjoyment of the series. Far from it. I think that makes this series extra fun and adventurous, and it almost feels cozy to an extent. I wouldn't classify this as necessarily cozy fantasy, but it definitely has a little bit more of a lighthearted tone. Of course, it wouldn't be a recommendation for a completed series video if I didn't at least briefly talk about Brandon Sanderson. And the book and series I'm recommending is Mistborn Saga, the first book in the series being The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is, again, kind of a con story. I feel like there's a theme going on. And this is about our couple main characters who are trying to pull off this big heist to destroy the evil overlord, essentially. But they're doing it in such a way that they're trying to con the whole city into an uprising, essentially. It's a bunch of criminals trying to overthrow the evil overlord. This is a fun adventure. The magic system is incredible. The writing is fairly accessible, and this author in this series was something that I attempted when I was transitioning from young adult to adult, and I think it works perfectly. One of the main characters is truly an adult in his 30s, and then the other main character, Vin, is a teenager. So there are lots of different characters, and I think the mix of ages really would appeal to a wide variety of audiences, whether you're an adult or a young adult reader, or both. I don't need to talk about Sanderson anymore. He's prolific and people talk about him and recommend him all the time, so I won't spend any more time talking about this trilogy. This series has 3 books, and there is a companion series that contains 4 books that happens hundreds of years into the future after the conclusion. So I would say this series is only 3 books, but there are many more Sanderson books to come if this series and book pique your interest. Then we have the Daevabad trilogy, of course, first book being The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. And this is about, again, a con woman. I guess you know what type of books I like to read now. So this is about a con woman who accidentally summons a djinn while she's trying to con some people. She didn't mean to, and she gets swept away off into this magical city of the djinn. And we are actually following multiple points of view of our main character, the con woman, and also someone in the djinn city, and politics ensue. And the reason I think this is such a great young adult, appealing adult fantasy work is the slow burn romance that happens in here. There are a lot of romance tropes in here that I think would appeal to a young adult reader. I really enjoy this trilogy. There is also a short story collection that comes after this trilogy, and if you like politics, if you like desert fantasy, I highly recommend The City of Brass and the Daevabad trilogy. If you're a young adult reader trying to get into adult sci-fi and adult space opera for the first time, I recommend Velocity Weapon, which is the first book in the Protectorate trilogy by Megan E. O'Keefe. Now, this is about a woman, not a con woman at this time. This is about a woman who wakes up on a spaceship and she has kind of lost her memories and she's trying to figure out what's going on, and the spaceship has like an AI system on it that's trying to like coach her through running the ship, and she's trying to figure out how to survive, and the ship is trying to help her to an extent. And a lot more happens in this series than that, but I don't want to give away spoilers. This is an epic sci-fi that's super fast-paced and super adventurous. And this also has a great sibling dynamic in it. The main character is trying to figure out how to get back to her brother, and the brother is also trying to figure out how to get back together with his sister and what happened to her and how she ended up in this situation. And I think this is an incredibly accessible sci-fi trilogy, and all 3 books are out, and I just had a blast, especially listening to this on audiobook. The AI spaceship adds an element of humor that I think is super funny to me personally, and I think would be funny to young adult readers as well. If you are a more classic fantasy reader, a Chosen One lover, then I cannot recommend highly enough John Gwynne and the Faithful and the Fallen quartet, the first book being Malice. This book and this series is about a prophecy that tells of an avatar for the light and an avatar for the darkness are going to amass armies and duke it out for the fate of the world. And we're following a cast of characters, and several people think that they are the chosen one of the light and they're going to vanquish the evil, but not everyone can be the chosen one for good. And this is also following, and the reason I call it a really great young adult recommendation is because we start off with, one of the perspectives is a boy named Corbin, and this is about him growing up and fighting off bullies and, training to become kind of a warrior. And so it's kind of a coming of age story for Corbin as well, which I think is a great young adult fantasy trope, and something I sometimes miss when I'm reading adult fantasy is some of that like coming of age, coming into your own character arc that happens, and Malice definitely has that. There are also a bunch of other characters that I think would appeal to a young adult reader, and some of the tropes in here, again, I think would be really great. This doesn't really have necessarily a ton of romance in it, but if you're a big fan of classic fantasy or the Chosen One tropes, I love John Gwynne. I think this one's a must read, personally. We are slowly but surely making our way through this list and getting slightly more advanced in terms of my recommendations. The next series I'm going to recommend, surprise, surprise, is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, the first book being Jade City. I love this series so much. This is about two crime families. Okay, I like criminals, I guess. Okay, I love gray morality in books, but this is about an island nation where two crime families rule and are, fighting each other, and they control this magical substance called jade, which enhances like their abilities for martial arts and fighting and all sorts of things. And in the story, we realize that there is some sort of like artificial jade drug that is being circulated on the market, and we're following one particular crime family as they're trying to unravel who is introducing this drug into the underground and rooting out the cause. And of course, this balloons and becomes even more political. So I can't not smile when I talk about this series because I love it so deeply. If you're a fan of urban fantasy, if you're like a City of Bones young adult reader, definitely read Jade City. This is an urban fantasy. There are cars and telephones and that type of stuff. I think the character work in here is incredible. We're primarily following like 3 points of view of the same crime family and watching them go through this epic journey is how I'll describe it. But this is starting to veer into more advanced fantasy, I would say. We're still kind of in the middle of the list, but we're growing up. We're advancing in our fantasy reading a little bit. And this is three books in the series, and every book's out. And there are 2 short story collections after, if you want to continue and read beyond the novels. Then we have Foundry Side, which is the first book in the Founders trilogy by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is about a thief. This is about a thief who is tasked with stealing an artifact, and she decides this is a pretty cool artifact, and she decides to keep it, and chaos ensues. Now, the reason I put this on the list here is while this is super fast-paced and the main character is fairly young and could appeal to a young adult audience, the magic system in this world is incredibly complex. It's kind of like computer coding, where you can hack into an object's makeup and convince it to do something else and to be something else, which is incredibly interesting and hard to explain. So now we're getting more and more advanced in terms of the adult fantasy, in my opinion, but this is incredibly fast-paced. I think it's a pro. Some people might think it's a con, but this almost feels like a movie or like a movie script. Not that it's bare bones or anything like that, but it moves so quickly and there's so much action. I couldn't put this book down. I read this in like one sitting, just like couldn't get enough of it, which I think is why I think it would appeal to a young adult reader. However, we're getting a little bit more advanced in terms of our magical fantasy craftsmanship here. And this is a trilogy, and I loved every single book in the trilogy, and I think I gave every book 5 stars. Now, this series is not beginner friendly, and I would say has a much darker and much more serious tone. And that is the Dandelion Dynasty Quartet by Ken Liu, the first book being The Grace of Kings. Like I said, this one is much more serious, much darker, and much more epic, I will say. The first book in the series is about 2 rebels who might be classified as criminals who at first are on the same side of the rebellion, and they have different methodologies, and they become really good friends. They're trying to overthrow the emperor, who's pretty corrupt, and throughout the course of the book, their paths diverge and they eventually become enemies to one another. And if you love friendship, if you love politics, if you love family dynamics, this is the series to go for. This is classified as a silk punk fantasy, which is something I had never read before personally, but I think it's incredible. It's almost like Industrial Revolution-y, but slightly different in its technology with this fantasy. This is slow and told, it has so many points of view, it can be hard to keep track, but the character work in this series is truly phenomenal and the world building is incredible. I love this series so much, but it is not it's not for everyone, which I totally understand, and it is not for the faint of heart or the beginner to the adult fantasy space, in my opinion. Another sci-fi recommendation is actually a duology, and the duology is called the Texkalon duology, the first book being a memory called Empire by Arkady Martine. Now, this is about an ambassador, not a criminal for once, she's an ambassador, and her name is Mahit Dismar, and she is the new ambassador towards, she lives on a small colony. She's the ambassador to this large central empire, the capital of the empire. And once she gets there, she realized that the previous ambassador may or may not have been murdered. So this is a political intrigue heavy science fiction mystery epic is what I'll say. And of course, it balloons and becomes much bigger than just that little plot summary that I gave you. And the reason I have this a little bit later in the list, because it's a little bit more hard sci-fi, there's a little bit more science terminology and world building in that way that it might be a little bit harder to digest, but the mystery really drives this first book forward, and I think is something young adult readers could grasp onto and enjoy immensely. It's also won the Hugo Award and is much deserved in its accolades, and I really appreciate that it's also a duology. So it's shorter than some of the other series I've mentioned previously. The last completed series and the most advanced sci-fantasy book series I'm going to be discussing in this video. This is not for the faint of heart, the beginner, the tender-hearted, to be honest. And that is the Broken Earth trilogy, the first book being the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. Now, this book, it was one of the first books I read when I was like, adult fantasy recommendations for my little young adult reader. And this was one of the first ones on the list. And I gotta say, I love this series, but I was thrown for a complete loop because of all of these books, this is the most serious, visceral, hard-hitting, emotionally wrecking series ever. I cried and cried and cried reading this series. This is about a world that goes through frequent desolations where the world kind of ends over and over and over again, and we are currently in the fifth desolation, and we're following 3 main characters, and we bop between their points of view, and one of those points of view, I will say, is written in second person. So I understand this writing style might not be for you, but it is very much so worth it if you make it to the end of the series. And the reason I call this advanced fantasy, not just because of the material and the triggers in it, it's because of the fantasy world building and the almost science fiction nature of the world building. It kind of blends science fiction and fantasy together, which I personally, when I was trying to read this, was completely thrown off by, and I never experienced anything like it. I will say, please check the trigger warnings for this book in particular, especially if you're a parent. If you have a child, definitely the opening scene is harrowing and was hard for me to read, and I don't even have any children. And so that's why it's number 10 on this list. While I love this trilogy to the bottom of my heart, I don't know if I will ever reread it because it's so emotionally taxing. I need to be in a certain headspace to consume this story, but that doesn't mean I recommend it any less than any of the other books on this list. I just think this one is the most advanced in my opinion. All right. These are the first books of 10 fantasy and science fiction series that are completed. Every work is published, ordered from most appealing to a young adult reader to most advanced. And this is super heavy, so I am going to do a very quick sign off and say thank you so much for watching. I would love to know if you have any completed series recommendations. Leave them in the comments down below, and I will see you in another one very soon. Goodbye!